thank you for taking and showing your interest in this vitally important topic. And it's one that goes beyond mere compliance to achieve lasting differences for our communities and for our organisations. If I can take you back just a couple of steps, the Victorian Local Governance Association Board adopted a value proposition back in December 2020, and that full document's available on the VLGA website, even with a simple Google search. And I think it has a rich context in terms of what we're doing here today. It says that our overriding value at the VLGA is to strengthen and support good governance in local government that will enable, promote and facilitate trust and confidence in the sector. It goes on to say that we'll create value in the following ways, and this is just a handful. This is 3 of about 10 or a dozen points. We facilitate highly relevant discussions on complex issues which are readily accessible to all. We provide resources, information, professional development and education, and undertake projects and events that support good governance and leadership. And we advocate for participation in local democracy that's inclusive and represents the diversity of the community, and deliver programs that build the capacity of candidates and councillors. And I hope you can see the relevance to those points in terms of what we're doing today. So in that spirit, I invite you as members to keep an eye out for our regular e-news bulletin, our events calendar, and of course our ongoing and topical VLGA Connects YouTube videos and podcasts. I might add we're the sponsors of Chris Eddy's rather excellent local government news podcasts that he produces twice a week. And of course, anyone here whose council is not a member, welcome, and we look forward to chatting with you soon and often about remedying that situation. So today, participation in local democracies, a large element of what we'll talk about. The session's particularly designed to support the leadership role of councillors in oversighting local implementation of this landmark legislation, and as I mentioned, in ways that will make a meaningful difference to your organisation, to local communities, the state, and indeed the nation. So on that note, can I just say welcome to you all, and also to Deborah Wu, our Inclusion and Diversity Lead, and over to you. Thanks, Deborah.
Thanks, Steve, and thank you everyone for coming along today. It's great to see so much interest in this topic, in the Gender Equality Act, and in understanding your role as councillors in the implementation of the Act. But first of all, I would also like to acknowledge, on behalf of the VLGA, the traditional owners of country throughout Victoria, from where we're all zooming from, and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and community. On behalf of the VLGA, we pay our respects to the traditional owners, their elders past, present and future, and to their cultures. And if you want to pop in the chat where you're zooming from today, the traditional owners of the land, that would be great. It's always nice to see the mix of different traditional owner groups that are represented. So in terms of what we'll cover today, we are going to look at the background to the Gender Equality Act, look at the aims of the Act and some of the definitions that are contained within it. We'll look at the basic responsibilities for defined entities, so in this case councils, which include workplace gender audits, gender equality action plans and gender impact assessments, and also what you need to know or do as a councillor and what changes you may see as a result of the implementation of the Act. Now, the other thing that I want to say is if any of you have any questions throughout today, feel free to just let me know. I guess either if you want to use the raise hand function, that will work pretty well. Otherwise, you're more than welcome to pop a message in the chat, and we'll try and keep track of that as much as we can. I might have to get Steve to jump in if there's something that comes up in the chat, because I might be too busy speaking. But definitely feel free to ask questions during, and we'll also have some space for questions at the end. Cool. Well, with that, let's get into it. So start with background. So one of the things that I think is really important to remember in the context of the Gender Equality Act is that it didn't occur in a vacuum. All of this work really came out of the Royal Commission into Family Violence that took place in 2016, or that handed up its findings in 2016. And the Royal Commission found that family violence is a gendered crime. So it's not exclusive of any particular group, but the majority of victims, and that's 75%, are women. It also found that gender inequality is the key driver behind family violence, and that gender equality needs to be addressed if we want to address all forms of violence against women, in particular family violence. But it's not just happening in our homes, it's also reinforced by things that we're seeing in our schoolyards, on our TV screens and in sporting fields, the attitudes that we hold as a society and the stereotypes and norms that we put forward. We also know that gender inequality does not impact on all people in the same way. So there are some different factors, different types of discrimination and disadvantage that also compound the impact that gender inequality has on particular groups. And I think that that's one of the things that I'd really like to impress upon you today, that the Gender Equality Act is not just about men and women or non-binary people, it's also about a range of different factors, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So from the Royal Commission into Family Violence in 2016, the Victorian government released Safe and Strong, which is Victoria's gender equality strategy. In that strategy, there were a range of different things, but the vision that it laid out was that all Victorians live in a safe and equal society with access to power, resources and opportunities, and are treated with respect and fairness. So that's pretty standard stuff. It's something that's, it reinforces the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities that was passed in 2006. So it's not really anything new. And for those of you who have done our diversity and inclusion training already, you may remember our friend Fred, freedom, respect, equality, dignity. That is basically, the principle behind that first point. It also states that all Victorians recognise that gender equality is essential to our prosperity and that gender inequality has significant effects. And it also hopes that Victoria will lead the way in gender equality with sustained and measurable action. And I think that arguably, even just through the passage of this Act, Victoria is leading the way. So this is an excerpt from the strategy, that it would be hard to find a country in the world that has successfully tackled entrenched gender inequality without any constitutional or legal reform. Just to give you a little bit of context, the World Economic Fund rates Australia at the moment number 50 in terms of our gender parity. So we were 45, now we're at 50. So we're sliding backwards. In contrast to that, in terms of educational attainment, we're number 1 of educational attainment for women and girls. So we're doing really well at educating women in Australia. We're not doing very well at getting equal outcomes. So, some of those countries that have achieved that parity are sort of the Nordic countries that have put in gender equality acts. So Safe and Strong really lays out the roadmap for the development of the Act. So from 2016 to 2020, the initial bill was released in 2019, and it explored some best practice examples from around the world and identified key levers. So these included gender equality legislation, so that's the obvious one, using purchasing and funding power, and I think that's a really important one, not necessarily just in the context of the Act, but it's a really easy one for local governments to use. Your role as procurers and purchasers really means that you can put standards on action or behaviour that you would like to see from your providers. So if we think about examples with, say, sporting clubs or other providers that you might either give money to in grants or by purchasing services, there's a lot that you can do there. I'd also say, if you've ever applied for a Victorian government grant in the last few years, you will have seen that there are certain requirements in terms of, do you have a family violence leave policy? Do you have a gender equality action plan within your organisation? And those are things, that's just an example of how you can use that purchasing and funding power. Another best practice example was gender lens approach to policies, budgets and economic planning. So by using gender impact analyses and gender responsive budgeting. We won't get into gender responsive budgeting today, but it is important. We will get into the gender impact analyses. And then scrutiny of public sector employment practices through gender audits and utilising targets. So one of the targets that's laid out in Safe and Strong is a 50% target for councillors and mayors in Victorian councils. We need to be able to set benchmarks and targets in order to achieve particular aims. So the bill was introduced in 2019 with extensive public consultation. There were 56 submissions, 700 responses. They had face-to-face stakeholder workshops, and interestingly, they also undertook a citizens' jury process. It passed into law on the 20th of February last year, received royal assent 5 days later, and then commenced on the 31st of March 2021. So relatively recently. It's a special day for me. It was my birthday, but it is, it's in force right now. So there are some significant implications that you'll need to consider for your councils. So now we move on to aims of the Act and definitions. Before that, did anyone have any questions about anything that I've raised so far?
Mark Eckel made a comment just expressing surprise at the 75% statistic and thought it might have even been as high as 90. I mean, too high either way, but I just wonder if you have anything to add to that.
I think that is particularly in reference to family violence and violence within the home, as opposed to just generally victims of violence. So I think that's the answer behind the discrepancy. Bernadette?
Yeah, Deborah, I know you're not going to cover it, but just wondering about the gender responsive budgeting. I've asked at Maribyrnong if we can have some kind of gender budget overview this year. So be happy if you've got a link to something that might assist with that. That'd be great.
Yeah, well, I'd really recommend reaching out to Women's Health West. I know that they've done some work on it. They may even have some resources that are online already, but they're part of the Gender Equality, Action for Gender Equality Partnership or Consortium that is part of the panel of providers appointed by the Commission by the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector. So they're really well equipped to assist you, and that goes for all of the councils that we have represented today. If you are looking for more advanced support in implementing the Gender Equality Act or bringing in some more advanced measures, all of those Action for Gender Equality partners are really well placed to help you, and they're already doing work with your communities through the Women's Health Services. So aims of the Act and definitions, the way that gender equality is defined in the Act is gender equality means equality of rights, opportunities, responsibilities and outcomes between persons of different genders. So it promotes gender equality by requiring positive action from all of the defined entities towards achieving workplace gender equality. But it's not just an internally focused piece of legislation, it's also requiring positive action in the consideration and promotion of gender equality in policies, programs and services. The Act also establishes the Public Sector Gender Equality Commissioner and the Independent Commission to provide education, support the implementation and enforce compliance. It will be difficult to see, you'd have to pretty egregiously fail in your responsibilities under the Act to require compliance to be enforced, but it can be enforced via VCAT. So that would really be, if you're failing to submit the documents that are necessary or, you're not reporting against progress, that sort of thing, but it is possible. There is that stick as well as the carrot of positive action. So I'm not going to read all of these out because they're pretty easily available. They're printed verbatim in the Act, but there are 10 gender equality principles that are set out by the Act, and they really recognise the human rights, the benefits of gender equality, the impact on family violence prevention, economic, social health benefits, but also that thing that I spoke about before in terms of intersectionalities, so that gender inequality may be compounded by other forms of disadvantage. I guess the last one that's also important is special measures may be necessary to achieve gender equality. So we spoke about intersectionality, and I mentioned before that the Gender Equality Act is not just about gender. Gender inequality may be compounded by other forms of disadvantage or discrimination that people might experience, and that includes characteristics like race, Aboriginality, religion, ethnicity, disability, age, sexual orientation, or gender identity. And the Act really requires organisations to consider these in concert with the other impacts that people might be experiencing when they're developing measures to promote gender equality. And you might decide in your council that there are a few other factors that go into that as well. For example, we know that there are differences in outcomes between regional and rural and metro and their metro counterparts for women and for men. Or you might decide that certain postcodes experience different levels of disadvantage. So, you know, it really gives you a framework for looking at how, well, if we go back to the social determinants of health argument, it gives you a framework for looking at how all of these different things intersect. So the basic responsibilities under the Act, and I think this is the juicy stuff that everyone wants to know about, right? So under the Act, councils must measure, report on, plan for and progress gender equality. So there's two key respects in which they need to measure and take positive action. One of them is workplace gender equality. That is primarily a responsibility of the CEO. Although obviously as councillors you will have an oversight function in that respect. Promoting gender equality in their policies, programs and services, again operationally in terms of recommendations, this will be done by officers, but you will have oversight and strategy roles to play in this respect as well. So in terms of the actual requirements, councils will be required to undertake gender impact assessments on all policies, programs and services, workplace gender audits against workplace gender equality indicators, gender equality action plans, so strategies and measures as well as the audit results. And these need to be publicly available documents that are provided to all executive employees and employee representatives. So you want everyone from your directors to your depot workers to be aware of the gender equality action plan and how it might impact them. And then you need to consistently report on progress. So that means that you need to be measuring progress as well. So for workplace gender audits, councils via the CEO need to report against some of these indicators. And they include the gender composition of all levels of the workforce. And in local government, we have women making up 60.9% of the workforce, with 34% of directors, 39% of managers, and around 34% of CEOs. This figure's fluctuated a little bit recently just because of some incoming and outgoing CEOs. And you know, in that, you'll also look at gendered segregation within the workplace. So if you have, and that's not to say, I think the really key thing is, that's not to say if you find that all your depot workers, or you know 85% of your depot workers are men, or 85% of your in-home care workers are women, that's not to say that you have to immediately change that, but you should be looking at why that is, and if there is anything that can be done to address it, if it is seen to be a problem, and you might look at pay within that. It also looks at gender composition of governing bodies. So in this case, for councils, the governing body is the council, comprised of councillors. So as we know, 44% of councillors are women at the moment, and that's a record number. And approximately 45% of mayors are women in Victoria at the moment. And you will know from your own council what that level of, what that composition is. And I guess the Commission for Gender Equality in the public sector recognises, and the government recognises, that this is a democratically elected process, so that you can't necessarily control how many women or how many men are elected to council. But what you can do is measure the progress over time, and you can look at strategies to better support women or address barriers to women's involvement in council. It also asks you to look at equal remuneration for work of equal or comparable value across levels of the workforce, irrespective of gender. So we know that the gender pay gap is pretty persistent in Victoria. It's around 10%, and it's even higher in the public sector. Well, so 9.6%, 10%. So that's the higher figure. It asks you to look at sexual harassment in the workplace as well. And we know from the recent Victorian Auditor General's report into sexual harassment in local government that councils are not providing workplaces that are free from sexual harassment. So we can quite easily say on that measure that councils are not meeting that obligation. But I guess what we're trying to do initially is create a baseline audit of our workplaces and then see how we can improve from there. It also looks at recruitment and promotion practices in the workplace and availability and utilisation of terms, conditions and practices like family violence leave, flexible working arrangements and working arrangements that support employees with family or caring responsibilities. And then, as I said, the gender segregation within the workplace. So the first workplace gender audit is due on the 31st of October this year, and it will look at data that's available from the 30th of June 2021. It needs to look at gender disaggregated data against the workplace gender equality indicators. And there's some pretty sophisticated templates that are up there on the Commission website for council officers to use. It needs to consider intersectionality, so what we said before about the different compounding factors that might also impact. And I think that this is a great opportunity for councils, if you see this as of strategic benefit, to start to measure some of the things that we haven't been measuring around council cohorts. So things beyond gender makeup, where we look at possibly disability, age, those sorts of things that, you know, are interesting but have never been collected so far. Councils have also been granted use of the People Matters survey that the Victorian public sector uses, and this will be used to assist the baseline workplace gender equality audit. So the audit should also report against prescribed targets, so 50% women in councils and mayors by 2025. As I said, it's not about what you can't control in how people vote, it's about what you can control in terms of the strategies and measures that you can put in place. So the first one is due also on the 31st of October, and then every 4 years from that. They need to include the results of the workplace gender audit to assess the current situation, and then strategies and measures that can improve gender equality in the workplace that are based on the results of the audit. So the audit will probably identify some issues, and then it needs to look at how you might be able to improve those issues. It needs to include it needs to consider the gender equality principles that include intersectionality. It should demonstrate some consultation with employees, employee representatives, so unions or other associations, and the governing body, which it says e.g. board, but this is e.g. council or i.e. council. And also you need to demonstrate that there are sufficient resources that have been allocated to develop and implement the Gender Equality Action Plan and its measures. So if your council already has a Gender Equality Action Plan, it can be used as the basis of your obligations, but it does need to include the audit data and associated strategies. But I would say that in this particular case, despite the names being quite similar, the aims of councils' existing gender equality action plans tend to be quite different. So I just keep that in mind. It may actually be more work than it's worth trying to make the two documents fit into one. So it needs to comply with any other legislation or government strategies like the Fair Work Act, the Equal Opportunity Act, the Sex Discrimination Act, and any enterprise agreements or workplace determinations that you have. So just because you see that there's a discrepancy in pay between two different, levels of employees doesn't mean that you overturn the EBA, for example. You need to comply with the existing legislation and agreements. One of the things that we are doing for officers across council organisations, not just people and culture, is running an Introduction to Gender Equality in Victoria workshop. The one on the 6th of May is already booked out, but we will be doing another one soon. So that's about understanding the legislative landscape. The things that you need in the Gender Equality Action Plan, to recap: baseline audit analysis, the meaningful consultation and engagement, a case for change, so that's quite important, being able to identify the issues and why they need to change, strategies and measures that will be used, demonstrate that you've got leadership buy-in and resourcing for your action plan. And then the progress also needs to be measured and reported against every 2 years in between that 4-year action plan cycle. So we'll start on gender impact assessments. This one I think is really important and probably broader than any of the other requirements so far. And it is also currently in effect. So it's something that you should probably start thinking about soon. So we recognise that your gender can affect your needs and experiences, which means that policies, programs and services impact people of different genders and intersectionalities in different ways. And if we're not thinking about how our work affects different types of people, we might unintentionally reinforce inequalities. I think it's also just about doing our work well and efficiently. So if our work isn't affecting the people that we're trying to affect, the target audience of any policy, service or program, you're wasting money and not making good decisions. So it's really about streamlining the spending, also streamlining the work that we're doing, not duplicating things or failing to accommodate particular aspects of the community. So for gender impact assessments, the requirement commenced with the Act on the 31st of March. All new policies, programs and services that directly and significantly impact the public, as well as those up for review, need to have gender impact assessments conducted. And that's really where it opens up a can of worms. So what is direct and significant? The Commission has been very helpful and left it up to the defined entity, in this case the Council, to determine the definition. So what I would say from there is that you might want to look at the Local Government Act and what has been defined as basically, in slightly different words, direct and significant in requiring deliberative engagement. So those major policies, there's a list of about 4. Steve, did you want to rattle them off? I mean, everyone will be pretty across the ones that are required.
Oh, well, the major strategies. So council plan, financial plan, asset management plan, rating and revenue strategy, certainly they would be the high order ones. But if you move down your strategic framework to some of your, ageing well strategy, family, youth and children strategies, all of those documents, of course, they would also require consultation, and you would expect, sorry, Deborah, I got to the question eventually, would be direct and significant.
Yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Thanks, Steve. So those ones I would say are the basic ones that you would want to include gender impact assessments on. The council engagement policy and the consultation that you do as part of that on those strategies will also feed into the gender impact assessment, and we'll go into that in just a minute in terms of the process. But you don't have to make it narrow. You don't have to stick with the really basic things. You can go broader if you want to, but I think it is useful to come up with a definition initially, and it may be that you come up with a relatively narrow definition with the basics and start to trial how gender impact assessments might work in different departments or different teams as you start to receive reports from officers. So just starting to rotate that across all areas of the organisation to get that skill up to scratch. So they can be conducted on any policy, whether small or large, and it really allows you to consider the experiences of the entire community by asking questions, collecting data and developing options. So really what you would expect anyway when you're considering a particular policy program or service. So they need to assess the effects that the policy program or service has on people of different genders, explain how it will be changed if it needs to be changed to better support Victorians of all genders and promote gender equality, and where practical, also apply that intersectional approach. So in terms of the steps, the first step is to define the issue and challenge assumptions. So, what is the problem or issue that you're looking at? And that may be what is the particular change that we're looking at making? What's the policy that we're reviewing? And look at how this problem or issue might be shaped by gender and the other intersectionalities. Then understanding your context, and this is really about doing a bit of research. It might be direct consultation with the community, it might be doing some surveys, it might be looking at existing census or demographic data, and then coming up with an options analysis, so providing some potential options and weighing the gendered or intersectional impact of each. Then they should be making a recommendation based on the best possible option, given those potential options that are available. Then for you as the decision makers, you need to decide what that best option is. So this is a really good example of a gender impact assessment in practice, and this comes from the Commission for Gender Equality in the Public Sector's website. And it's with Glenelg Shire Council. So they looked at the Portland Leisure and Aquatic Centre, or PLACE. And I think this is a really great example because it shows that this isn't a feminist left-wing agenda. This is actually just looking at a service and working out how you make it work better. So the problem was that there were potential barriers to use and enjoyment of the facility. So they looked for, in the context, data on current users. They looked at they conducted some user surveys and some staff workshops. And what they found was that women were attending as carers, so, dropping their kids off or staying while their kids were doing swimming lessons, but not exercising at the facility. That young women's attendance was particularly low, and that there were concerns about safety and security of possessions. They also found that men rarely attended the group classes. So then they also conducted some secondary research and stakeholder consultation to find out why, or to speak to some of those people who were not attending or not using the facility and why that was. So from there, they came up with new marketing and promotion campaigns. So they started to target the women as carers, so providing activities, exercise activities for women to do as they were dropping their kids off for swimming. They changed the name from Mermaids Water Aerobics to Water Fitness. And that is such a small win. Steve and I always like to talk about the small wins. That is such an easy thing to do. But if you think about the impact on, the potential impact there for men on attending those group classes, that's huge. They implemented student and bring a buddy concession rates because they knew that women were less likely to exercise if they didn't have a buddy to bring with them. They installed lockers for people's possessions, and they scheduled some classes that were after school for young adults. So none of these things particularly stick out to me as necessarily being gender equality or necessarily having any sort of agenda, but they're just good examples of how you can look at an issue, work out how the way that things are being done currently is affecting certain groups, and then addressing that. Well, we'll move on to what you need to know or do as a councillor. So to start with, you need to understand council's broad obligations under the Act and understand gender equality principles and rationale. Hopefully we've been able to do that for you today. You should be encouraging the use of gender lens and a gender impact analysis and gender responsive budgeting wherever possible, and exploring those opportunities like Bernadette has done. You should be facilitating opportunities for relevant data collection wherever possible. So as we established with the last example, where, the more data that you can collect on how people are using your facilities, services, programs, the better. It allows you to make better decisions. Consider the Act as it intersects with your responsibilities under the Local Government Act. So your responsibility or your role as a councillor to consider the diversity of interests and needs of the municipal community. Look at the other intersections with legislation that might be there. So the Municipal Health and Wellbeing Plan, so that's a big chunk of it. The community engagement policy, things like that. Recognise the health, economic and social benefits of gender equality in your community, including budget benefits for council. So you're getting a better return on investment if your services are better targeted to their audience. This is a little bit higher level, I think, but considering the adoption of policies that improve the workplace culture and conditions of staff in line with the workplace gender indicators, So one of them would be, how can you take positive measures to eradicate negative indicators like sexual harassment? Or how can you support policies in your strategic capacity? How can you support policies that might make the workplace a better workplace for your staff? Consider the resourcing of council staff when you're looking at budget processes to undertake relevant activities related to obligations under the Act. So some of the things that will need to be done for gender impact assessments might require a little bit more time to collect more data or approach things in a different way. So is that financially resourced, or is it already covered under your council's community engagement policy? You might need to think about as well whether your staff across all of the departments have the requisite knowledge to undertake their duties in relation to the Act. As we've established, it's not super complicated, but I think that it does require a bit of a primer and a bit of a certain level of understanding of the principles and processes involved. And then you need to consider your duty to promote gender equality under the Act. As a member of the governing body of a defined entity under the Gender Equality Act, you do have a duty to promote gender equality. So how are you acting as a role model for gender equality in your community? What changes you may see as a result? At a macro level, you should see a decrease in gendered violence, an improvement in economic outcomes. So we know that businesses with at least 30% of women in leadership positions are 15% more profitable, that there's that family violence costs the economy in Victoria more than $3.4 billion a year and takes up 40% of police work. So that's a significant saving if we can make that happen. There's an improvement in human rights outcomes and the safer and healthier community. At a council level, the changes that you might see will be a more satisfied and productive workforce. You'll see a better return on investment for council spending. You'll have reduced exposure to risks, including sexual harassment, bullying, and fraud. There'll be more rigorous and evidence-based policy development process with policies, programs, and services that are actually tailored to the audience or communities that they're meant to serve, with a better take-up of council services by previously disenfranchised people. And from that, you'll have a decrease in hard-to-reach groups because they won't be hard to reach anymore because you'll be reaching them. And you should also see greater participation by women and other intersectionalities in the council decision-making process. And with that, a greater sense of belonging and greater social cohesion. Any questions? And they don't have to be about what I've covered today necessarily. It could also just be about the Act in general. Any questions that you have about that?
Thanks, Deborah. So the gender impact assessments, would we as councillors expect to see that come up when we have a recommendation with a report, say to a councillor briefing? Would we expect to see that document in its entirety as part of that briefing, or should we expect to see that, or should we expect to see a summary or some sort of reference to it? Like, at what scale would we expect to see that piece of work as part of another, you know, as part of a bigger report? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand what you mean. I guess it really is up to you and your procedure at the council. So what do you normally see? Like, you know, if an officer prepares a report, how much of that ends up in the minutes or agenda, or how much of that ends up in the attachments? That again also depends on how you define direct and significant. So how many of the reports will have a gender impact assessment conducted? But I think that's a conversation that you should probably be having with your CEO and governance manager, you know, just setting out the framework. What do we expect from you? What can we expect to see? What do we consider to be direct and significant, and who makes that determination on a case-by-case basis?
Thanks. Just one, I'm kicking around, I suppose, putting this gender lens over things, and probably the biggest thing we're grappling with at the moment is the council budget.
Yeah.
If I'm reading what you're telling us, it's a pretty wide gender lens that will be casting over the council budget, given the ramifications and inputs that we're looking at. So, I mean, if I look at, for argument's sake, our situation here in Bull Oak, we've got 6,500 kilometres of road to look after. Notionally, we should be investing over $6.5 million of ratepayers' money. How do I apply a gender lens to that?
That's a really great one, Daryl. And you might think that roads don't have anything to do with gender, but if you have a look then at who uses particular roads, what, you know, for example, are there roads around activity centres that might be related to education, childcare, particular forms of employment? Those are examples of how gender might play into it. You don't necessarily have to drill that deep into every single thing. If you determine that there's not necessarily a huge, again, that direct and significant impact that's associated to that particular strategy, then you won't necessarily need to drill that deep into it. But there is some work that can be done, and it probably goes more to gender responsive budgeting, which isn't a direct requirement of the Act, but is a useful sort of next step, if you will. Then you can look at the way that of that 6.5 million, how much of it goes to roads that are predominantly used by women or predominantly used by men, or both. If there's a net neutral, impact on all genders. Does that answer your question?
Oh, look, I mean, look, we all have varying degrees of budget input. So, I mean, that's just one example. I mean, what local government provides roughly 120 different services across the board. So, I mean, by the time you go through individually and, if you like, run the gender lens over one, or is it an overall balance and look at it, say, okay, this is what we're going to spend as a budget. Does it meet targets? I just think it's that wider question that sometimes the unintended consequences of supposedly good legislation can have outcomes that don't always hit the target.
Yeah.
Anyway, I know it does give, as a representative, an idea of the areas you're going to have to really look at to meet those targets. But look, I think it's good to have the discussion.
Yeah, it's a really good question though, Daryl, I think, because well, you might look at it and go, is there a different impact on how we spend money on roads between men and women? And you might say no. But that's the question that they're asking you to ask. So that's, the same. There's a good example of snow plows that we like to bring up, that's about a case in Sweden where they looked at, they were having lots of snow-related injuries in winter in this particular town in Sweden. And they found that, they were looking at their snow ploughing policy as a result. And a lot of women and children were ending up in emergency rooms as a result of snow-related injuries because they were the pedestrians and cyclists. Then they looked at their snow ploughing policy and found that the way that they were doing their ploughing was prioritising the main roads around workplaces instead of looking at the roads that were being used in the mornings to get people to childcare and schools. So that's an example of the impact that's different between men and women that you wouldn't necessarily think of when you're just looking at, snow ploughing. What does that have to do with gender? So it won't necessarily apply for you, not necessarily having much snow in Bull Oak, but there are things that happen or that it applies to that you wouldn't necessarily think about. Even lighting is another example. I know we've had a few more things in the chat, so I'll just try and open that up. Oh, the connection between gender equality and fraud. Steve, did you want to take that one?
I'm so glad. Thanks, Deborah. I'm so glad Olivia asked that. It's almost my favourite question. Olivia, thanks for that question. I think to find that link, it's worthwhile to go back to the Vlga report into sexual harassment in local government, and that in a number of reports, including as referenced by Deborah, have found that inappropriate behaviour at whatever level is power-based. One of the outcomes of implementation of the Gender Equality Act done well is a fairer culture in our organisations and an environment where people feel safer to speak up. One of the issues that we know in relation to fraud is that fraud is often covered up by the absence of a speak up culture. So I guess that link is that done well, that the Gender Equality Act in creating a better culture in our organisations will also have an impact on our exposures to fraud.
I guess the other thing that I'd add to that very simply is that the gender impact analyses require a better, or assessments, sorry, require a better understanding of the effects that your policies are actually having on people. So if they're not having an effect and you're spending a huge amount of money on them, you're able to see that. So I think that's another way that it addresses fraud.
Deborah Despy's asked a question which I think tacks on to Daryl's comment too, also about sporting grounds. I just wonder if you have a comment on that.
Yeah, well, definitely. I think that sporting grounds are one that people are pretty familiar with in terms of the gender impact. If we look at sports that are targeted to people of different genders, or facilities that are attached to sporting grounds, or even on usage of the grounds. So, you know, you might not get to a point where you're looking at equal usage, but you might get to a point where you're looking at opportunities promoted for equal usage or more equitable usage, or making sure that there are those facilities in place if women do want to use the facilities. A really great place to go for that would be Change Our Game, or the Office for Women in Recreation, the Office for Women in Sport and Recreation. Yeah, and it's very true, Rosie, that there's very few of the sporting facilities, and that's one of the things that the Victorian government's been trying to do in their grant sort of funding, is looking at that application to women in sport. Mark?
Oh yes, hi, thanks, and what an interesting segment you've got. I'm not coming up in the video because I'm unshaven.
That's all right.
But for a reason. I'm particularly interested, you know, I'm from Mildura Rural City Council. I've been a councillor for 20 years, and we've got a very robust council in regards to gender equity. And, as you probably are aware, probably the first council in Victoria to have gender equity portfolio. And I'm really concerned about the schools and what process and what responsibility councils have got to play within their municipality for respectful relationships, which is such an important component of the Royal Commission's work. And I don't see, and you might allude me to the fact, I don't see any obligation there from councils in respect to making sure that all schools have got this in their curriculum. Can you throw any light on that, please, Deborah?
Yeah, well, you're right. There's no explicit obligation there. And I guess in terms of curriculum, it probably goes back to more the state and even the federal government in some respects. But one thing that you can use as some justification for working with your schools to encourage respectful relationships and to encourage that sort of thing is that duty to promote gender equality in your community. So we spoke about the 3 requirements. So in terms of the actual things that you need to hand up and hand over or undertake, but there is also a general duty to promote gender equality. And, you know, it's, as I said, it's not in the legislation that you must provide respectful relationships training or curriculum, but you're right, it is one of the key things that is needed to change the conversation and change the outcomes as identified by our watch and by the Royal Commission into Family Violence.
Yes, if there's an audit of the Act into the future, I think it's something that we should be concentrating on, because if we don't change it in the schools, if we don't change the attitudes of our young people, and right through to year 12, I agree with the respectful relationships curriculum. then we're never going to change things. Like I think we're all getting really tired of the situation where statements are continually made that things are getting worse. You know, and these last issues, I raised it in council the other night. It was a very emotive mention in council about the terrible crimes committed to women in recent times that really tears at the heart and tears at within all of us as to where is our community going. And so I just think that we need to send a message possibly to the government. They're doing a wonderful job in this area. I'm not having a quip at them, but I just think that respectful relationship, there should be a line item as far as that's concerned in the future of our gender equity.
Well, some of the schools, so for state schools, they will be affected by the Gender Equality Act, so they'll have their own responsibility there. But I guess the other thing is that this act really, so you'll notice that it doesn't apply to businesses, it's about the public sector. What it really tries to do is affect change in ways that that organisation or defined entity can control. So what's the impact that you're having on the public or the community? How can you direct that impact towards gender equality? So I guess that's the thing there. I mean, you might want to look, so you've got that general duty to promote gender equality under the Gender Equality Act. You've also got the Victorian Local Government Women's Charter as a potential lever there. And then also, I mean, there's a few different things that you can use to justify action on that. But generally working on supporting your community, I reckon that you would have justification, and maybe also put it within your municipal health and wellbeing plan as well. To support schools to undertake that.
Thanks, Deborah, and thanks for the day, and lovely to see you too, Steve. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat, and thank you, Despy, for holding down the fort while I've been otherwise occupied. It's great to see your responses as well, and I really appreciate that collaborative approach. So if we start with, through facility users, that could be where we make a difference, and that's definitely true. If we go back to that, the role of councils as procurers and purchasers, grant givers, and facility owners often, there's a real role that you can play there in impacting that. Marika, did you want to talk about your comment?
I think I've probably said it all. I just put a link there that might help. I was sort of half open. I had it open in the background, and I've sort of half read part of it earlier this week. So I was planning on finishing that off. That might help some people with the previous conversation. But that was just an example. That was like when I first got on council in 2016. So it was just sort of, and there was also a hairdresser right near there. So, you know, their clients and the clients at the not-for-profit just kept getting pinged by our parking inspectors. And it was a really little strip shopping centre. And, you know, no one seemed to mind if we took away the time restrictions. And it just meant they didn't have to try and like rush out or miss the end of their session, so they didn't get a parking fine. And these were vulnerable women as well, and they cater to that specific cohort. So also couldn't afford a fine. So I just thought that was an example that someone might enjoy.
No, it's good. One of the things that we'll be trying to do next week when we run that session, Introduction to Gender Equality with officers, is basically posing the question, what do you think that councils do that doesn't have anything to do with gender equality? It's a bit of a cheeky question because obviously we believe that there isn't anything that doesn't have anything to do with gender equality. But looking at those and how you might explore ways in which you can do an analysis and see the differences. And sometimes there might be none, honestly. That's what you want to see. Any other questions? Wayne?
So we've got a bit of an issue in the Central Goldfields Shire with after-hours school care. At the turn of last year, the two state schools in the Shire didn't apply for funding under the government plan. With the role at a 3-year-old kinder, the only private entity that we have in the Shire didn't have space for the after-hours school care. There didn't seem to be a lot of demand, but that seems like there's not a huge demand. There's you know, maybe 10, 12 kind of affected families that I'm aware of. In discussions with the council staff, you know, it's more of been advised that it's, you know, a role for the Department of Education. If council do get involved, then that kind of cancels out the likelihood of getting funding from the state departments. What kind of, I suppose, I'm trying to work out what my steps could be, or, you know, as far as advocacy, or, you know, is there something that, you know, we could potentially do? Yeah, this is, you know, I suppose, adds to that kind of gender equality, having that that service available for families.
Yeah, well, I guess, it's great that you're aware of the issue and looking at how you can take action on it. I think that the way that I would approach it from an advocacy perspective, whether you do this as you or whether you ask council officers to go in and do it, would be to speak to those families that are affected and to measure the impact that it's had on them to not have that service in place. And it may not necessarily be gendered, but I think that, you know, as I said, gender impact assessments, that process sets us up really well to look at policies and how they might affect particular people. And that might give you a position for advocacy to your local state member or the department, you know, asking for emergency funding. Or it might give you a basis to take action as a council in terms of funding that service yourself. But I think that if you're able to illustrate the issues and then potential options, that's a really good way to go about it.
Would the government schools, would that kind of fall under maybe their gender equity plans and things like that, rather than just the school themselves? Would they, I suppose, you know, look at the effects of that on families, as opposed to just, you know, looking inside their organisation, the effects of that on the outside as well?
Yeah, I think that definitely it falls within the remit. They may not have thought to do it. So encouraging them to do that is a good thing to do, because it is also all policies, programs and services. So there's the workplace bit that's internal, then there's the policies, programs and services that's external. So it might be a good way to approach it that way as well. Any other questions? We still have a little bit of time, but I might let you all go early and enjoy some sunshine. Any other questions from anyone else before we finish up? Or comments even?
Can I ask one, Deb?
Yep, Kat.
Kat here from Port Phillip. Hi. I had a question about it's similar to Bernadette's, about the tools that are available for us for budgeting, and whether there's any tools that you know of that are available to help make that process easier. Given I think everybody's well underway with their first term budgets, but stuff that we can pass on to our governance and CEOs that we think are already aware of it.
Yeah, well, again, I'd go towards the Action for Gender Equality Partnership. So we've got that up here. And again, this will all come to you in the slides. But I know Women's Health in the South East are really well placed to help you with that work. Some of it may, you know, have a fee for service implication, but it will set you up for the future. So the approach that they will take will really be around capacity building. So, you know, definitely for all of you, you will have relevant AGEP partners in your area, whether it be Women's Health East, Women's Health in the South East, Grampians, Loddon Mallee, whatever it might be, they're all really well placed to help you out. Yeah, I think that if you're at the stage where you're looking at being able to implement gender responsive budgeting, that's great. That's a really good step to be able to take. Anything else before we finish up? Well, I'll just tell you very quickly about some of the other things that we have in terms of resources here. So we've also got training that some of you have done already on diversity and inclusion in the context of the councillor role. We have the Gender Equality Act for councillors, which you've just been through. A session on Introduction to Gender Equality in Victoria, put on in partnership with Gender Equity Victoria for officers. And then we'll take some deeper dives into gender impact assessments in practice in some of those different areas beyond what we normally think about when we think about gender equality. And again, that's for officers and done in partnership with GenVic. And if there really is a lot of interest in finding out more about gender responsive budgeting in the context of councils, we can look at putting something on, but you need to let us know that you've got interest, and then we'll put all that together, because I think initially we've been trying to start at the lower end of the scale in terms of progress and supporting that, I guess even just meeting the obligations. Cool, thanks everyone. Steve, did you want to say something to wrap us up?
Yeah, I will. Thanks, Deborah, and everyone. Just on behalf of Catherine, our CEO, can I say thank you to Deborah for an excellent session? And I'll come back to that in a moment. One of the things we've been really anxious to do is to make it as simple for councillors to perform the role as councillors and for officers to perform the role of officers. And I hope that today you've developed a sort of greater insight as to how you as councillors can impact the effective implementation of this piece of legislation. Ultimately, we think that's a really important element of good governance, because if we get our roles and responsibilities right, there's a better chance of achieving good sort of cultural change. Deborah's touched on some upcoming workshops, and in that light, please communicate with us as to what you need, because in the partnership we've got with Gender Equality Victoria, we're really keen to be flexible and to target future resources to you on the basis of what you need. We're mindful that this is a reasonably crowded space, but we think there's a really good opportunity to be quite niche. So please, I guess that's my closing message. Talk to us about what you need on this and other topics. And once again, Deborah, thank you. That's been a fabulous session. Lots of accolades and well deserved. So stay safe, everyone. Thank you.